The spring came early that year to Asheville, as if the earth had remembered something the rest of them had tried to forget. Margot Ellison stood at the iron gate of the parish churchyard on a Tuesday morning in the second week of April, her cream gloves already damp from the walk across the lower meadow, a small bunch of white hawthorn blossoms in her hands. The gate swung on its hinge without protest. She had oiled it herself, the previous autumn, when she thought no one was watching. The path to the far corner was familiar enough that her feet found it without her eyes, past the rector's family plot with its carved angels, past the newer stone still white and raw from the mason's chisel, past the yew tree so old it had grown around its own iron fence. She stopped at the modest gray limestone marker in the corner where the churchyard wall met the kitchen garden boundary, and she crouched, and she laid the hawthorn at its base, and she stayed there for a moment, with her hand resting lightly against the cool stone. She did not pray. She did not know that she had words for prayer any longer. She had been doing this for 5 years. She would go on doing it, she supposed, until she could not. What she did not know, as she rose and smoothed her skirts and turned back toward the gate, was that she had been watched. That on the rise above the churchyard wall, half concealed by the shadow of the old stable block, a man stood with his hands still at his sides, and his expression perfectly unreadable, and that he had been standing there for considerably longer than she had been kneeling. That he had seen the hawthorn, that he had recognized the name carved into the gray limestone, and that the recognition had done something to his face that not a soul in his household had seen done to it in 5 years of trying. His name was Edmund Asheville, the Duke of Asheville, and the grave in the corner belonged to his steward's daughter, a girl named Betsy Crane, who had died in his service. And he had told himself, every spring since, that no one remembered her. He had been wrong. If you have ever wondered what it costs a woman to keep faith with the dead, stay close. This story will answer that question. It will answer several others you have not yet thought to ask. Margot Ellison had come to Asheville the previous September as companion to the Dowager Duchess, a position she had not sought and had accepted from necessity. Her father, a country clergyman of good family and modest means, had died that summer, leaving her a library of 700 volumes and a total of £11, and the position had been arranged by her father's cousin without her being consulted about the particulars. She was 29 years old, which the London season considered an inconvenient age for a woman without a fortune, and she had been told, in several ways and by several people, across the preceding months, that she ought to be grateful for the placement. To the Dowager Duchess, Lady Constance Asheville, she was a convenience. A well-read convenience, capable of reading aloud in French and Italian, as well as English, skilled at cards and at listening, unobtrusive in her appearance and her opinions. Lady Constance had said so directly in the first interview, in the west drawing-room with the afternoon light coming through the tall windows, and the fire making the room smell of good wood and candle wax. She had looked Margot up and down with those pale blue eyes, pale as winter sky, and just as measuring, and she had said, "You will do. You are not the sort of girl men make fools of themselves over, which is precisely what I require in a companion." Margot had thanked her. She had thought, privately, that Lady Constance was a woman who organized the world into those who required managing and those useful for managing them, and that she had been assigned to the second category without appeal. She had decided she could live with that. She was good at deciding she could live with things. The Duke himself she had not met until her 3rd week at Asheville. She had known he was in residence. The household ran on a different current when he was present, quieter and more precise. The footman standing straighter. the housekeeper Mrs. Yardley moving through the corridors with an efficiency that had an edge to it. She had heard him twice from a distance, his voice low and level from behind the study door, giving instructions to his steward, and she had formed a picture of him from those fragments and from what the housemaid said. A grave man, private, not unkind but not warm, a widower 3 years past whose grief had calcified into something she had not yet found a name for. She had met him in the library. She had gone there at 6:30 in the morning, before the household woke, because the library was the only room at Ashvale that felt fully hers between those hours, and she had been standing on the library ladder with a copy of Gilbert White's Natural History open in her hands, when the door had opened, and the Duke of Ashvale had walked in, stopped, looked up at her, and said nothing. He was taller than she had imagined. He wore a navy tailcoat and buff breeches, and his cravat had been tied but not perfectly, which was the only imperfect thing about him that she ever observed. His dark eyes found her on the ladder and stayed, and she had the sensation of being measured with an instrument she could not identify. She had waited for him to say something. He had not said anything for long enough that she had decided she must speak first. "I apologize, Your Grace," she had said, keeping her voice even. "I was not aware you used the library at this hour." "I do not," he had said. "Generally." And then he had walked to the far desk and sat down and opened a letter. And that had been the whole of it. She had descended the ladder with what dignity she could manage, replaced the book, and gone. She had told herself it meant nothing. She was a servant's companion, effectively, a woman of no account in his household, and he had looked at her the way one looks at a piece of furniture that has been moved to an inconvenient location. She had told herself that, with some persistence, over the following days, and had very nearly believed it, until she noticed that he had begun to use the library at 6:30 in the morning, every day thereafter. The spring that Margot made her annual visit to the churchyard, Lady Constance had also been watching. Not from the stable block, and not with the Duke's unreadable stillness. Lady Constance watched the way she did everything, from a chair, with a cup of tea cooling at her elbow, and her folded fan resting precisely against her knee, from a position she had arranged so that watching appeared to be merely existing. She had been the Dowager Duchess of Ashvale for 3 years, and the position had clarified her understanding of what required protecting. The name carved into that gray limestone in the churchyard corner was one of the things she had spent 3 years trying to put behind the household. "You went to the churchyard this morning," Lady Constance said when Margot arrived to read to her after breakfast. It was not a question. "I did," Margot said. She sat in her usual chair and opened the book to their place. "Betsy Crane has been dead 5 years, Lady Constance said, picking up her fan. "You were not acquainted with her. She was in service here before you arrived." "I was acquainted with her family," Margot said. "Her mother was a parishioner at Wyvern Cross. My father buried her. I promised the mother I would visit when I came to Ashvale." Lady Constance held the fan at a measured angle and looked at Margot over it. "A companion to this household," she said, "does not make promises to servants' families that create associations the household has moved past. You are not here as a clergyman's daughter. You are here as my companion, and you will conduct yourself accordingly." Margot set the book in her lap. "The grave is in the parish churchyard," she said carefully. "I believe I am at liberty to visit it." "You are at liberty," Lady Constance said, "to do what is useful to me, and to refrain from what is not. A woman in your position, Miss Ellison, cannot afford to be sentimental about people who no longer have the ability to benefit her." I had hoped that was understood. It was the first time. Margot heard the shape of it clearly. A woman in your position. She translated it without effort. She was, to Lady Constance, a woman without resources, without prospect, without standing. And the label was intended to remind her of that whenever she showed signs of forgetting. She picked up the book and began to read. She did not stop going to the churchyard. She went the following Tuesday, and the one after that, laying hawthorn because the hawthorn was in bloom, and because she had promised, and because Betsy Crane had been 19 years old when she died of a fever she had caught nursing a household full of sick children through an outbreak the previous November, and someone ought to remember that, regardless of whether it was useful to remember it. What she did not know, because she had not been told and had not thought to ask, was that the Duke had been at Ashvale that November. That he had been the one who called the physician when it became clear the fever was serious. That he had ridden out through 3 nights of hard weather and arrived too late by a matter of hours, and that the guilt of that arriving too late had settled into him like a stone into water and never come back up. She did not know that until the morning in May when she encountered him at the library door at the precise moment he was coming out and she was going in, and he stopped, and she stopped, and he said unexpectedly, with no preamble, "You knew Betsy Crane's family." "Her mother," Margot said. "She has since passed." "Before she did. I promised her I would visit the grave." He was quiet for a moment. The morning light came through the corridor window behind him, and she could not read his face. "She was a good girl," he said finally. 17 when she entered service, 19 when she died. "She wrote to her mother every week," Margot said. "Her mother read the letters to me when I called. She wrote very well. She described the estate as if she were painting it." He looked at her then, really looked at her. She felt. Not the measuring look from the library ladder, but something else. Something she could not categorize, because she had no name for a look that combined recognition with something close to pain. "Come inside," he said, gesturing to the library. And because it was a command, and because she had not yet learned to distinguish his commands from anything else he said, she came inside. He did not speak immediately. He went to the window and stood looking out at the kitchen garden, and she sat in the chair she had begun to think of as hers, and the room was quiet. Then he said, "To the window. My late wife died the same winter. A different illness. Different circumstances entirely. I have always been aware that grief does not choose its company with any particular consideration for the grieving." It was the most he had ever said to her. She understood instinctively that it was the most he said to most people. "No," she agreed. "It does not." He turned from the window. His expression had closed again, settled back into that contained gravity she had come to recognize as his ordinary face. "You are permitted to visit the grave whenever you wish," he said. "The churchyard is open. I will inform Mrs. Yardley that your absences on Tuesday mornings are accounted for." It was a command. It was also a protection. She was not sure, at that moment, whether she understood the difference. She did not think about him for the rest of that day. She thought about him considerably during the night, and told herself firmly by the gray morning that she must stop. She was, as Lady Constance had reminded her, a woman in her position. The county called for its first proper gathering in early June, a dinner at Whitmore Hall, the home of Sir Gerald Whitmore, a magistrate of some standing whose wife was the specific kind of woman who arranged rooms so that every guest understood their precise rank within them. Margot accompanied Lady Constance as a matter of course, wearing her best gown, which was cream silk with a modest trim, and which looked well enough in the glass of her small room, and rather less well in the dining room at Whitmore Hall, where Lady Whitmore's daughter Charlotte was wearing ivory silk with seed pearl embroidery and a necklace that had come from London this season. The Duke attended. He sat at the far end of the table, and he looked at his plate more than at the company, and Margot was seated well below him, between the curate's wife and a distant Whitmore relation whose name she did not catch. Lady Constance, seated near Sir Gerald, said at one point in a carrying voice, "My companion is the daughter of a country clergyman at Wyvern Cross, quite competent, very well read. One is grateful for the capable ones, however modest their origins." She said it pleasantly, as one says such things, and the table absorbed it. And the curate's wife nodded with an expression of sympathetic condescension. And Margot kept her eyes on her soup. That was the second time. If you are wondering what it costs to hold one's chin level when a room has just decided what you are, stay close. Margot had been holding her chin level for 9 months. It was in July that Lady Constance produced her plan, as Lady Constance produced most things from a position of unassailable logic. She called Margot to the morning room after breakfast, on a day when the windows were open to the garden and the roses were fully out, and the room smelled of warmth and greenery, which was almost cruel given the subject she intended to raise. "My nephew arrives next week," she said, settling her folded fan against her knee. "Mr. Peregrine Ashvale, the third in the succession. He has been in town for the season, and I have asked him to come down for the summer. He is a sensible young man, and I believe Ashvale would benefit from his presence." She paused. "He is also, I understand, in search of a practical arrangement. A wife who can manage a household on modest means, who will not expect more than is prudent to provide." Margot said nothing. She had learned, across 9 months in this house, that when Lady Constance was working toward something, interruption only lengthened the distance. "You are 29, Lady Constance continued, "and without prospect. Peregrine is 31, with a small entailed property in Shropshire and good standing in his profession. The match would be respectable. I have taken the liberty of mentioning you to him, favorably. He is agreeable to meeting you with the understanding that the arrangement is under consideration." The arrangement. Margot had heard those words before, in the particular tone Lady Constance used for them, which was the tone of a woman explaining to a horse which field it would graze in, and expecting the horse to be grateful. "I am not," Margot said carefully, "seeking a practical arrangement." Lady Constance's pale blue eyes did not move. "I am not asking what you are seeking, Miss Ellison. I am informing you of what is available and what is sensible. A woman in your position does not have the luxury of romantic preference." There it was again. A woman in your position. Third time now, and Margot heard it differently this time, not as a fact to be absorbed, but as a structure to be examined from the outside. She thought, and what, precisely, is my position? No family, no fortune, no home I own. 29, unmarried, the daughter of a clergyman, earning £28 a year as companion to a woman who had just arranged my future as efficiently as she arranged the dinner table. She thought all of this very quickly, and then she lifted her gaze from the empty fireplace and looked at Lady Constance and said, "Thank you for thinking of me. I will be glad to meet Mr. Ashvale when he arrives." She did not say anything else. She went to the library that evening, in the ordinary way. And she did not cry, because she had made a decision years ago about crying in other people's houses. She sat for a longer time than usual, with her hand still in her lap, and she did not open a book. He found her there. She did not hear him come in, which meant he had been quiet about it. And when she became aware of him, she had the impression he had been there long enough to have made a considered decision to stay. He was standing near the shelves on the far wall, looking at her, and she had the familiar sensation of being seen too clearly by someone she had not given permission to look. "You have not opened a book," he observed. "No," she said. "That is unusual." Yes, she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he crossed the room and sat in the chair across from hers, which was not usual, and she rearranged her expectations accordingly. "My mother has spoken to you," he said. It was not a question. "About Mr. Peregrine Ashvale," she said. "Yes." He looked at the empty fireplace for a moment. "Peregrine is a perfectly adequate man," he said, "with a perfectly adequate property, and a considerable talent for being agreeable on all occasions." He paused. "He is not, in my estimation, a man who knows what it costs to keep faith with anything." She stared at him. He was looking at the fireplace. She had no instrument for measuring what he had just said. "Walk with me," he said. She had learned, by then, something about his commands. She rose and walked with him. Through the library door, and along the east corridor, and out through the terrace door into the garden, where the evening air was warm and smelled of roses and cut grass, and they walked along the stone path in the failing light without speaking for several minutes, and it was more comfortable than silence had any right to be. He said, eventually, "The hawthorn at Betsy Crane's grave. Where do you find it?" "The hedge along the lower meadow," she said. "There is a gap in it just past the stile. The tree overhangs on the far side." "I have walked that meadow all my life," he said, "and I did not know there was hawthorn there." "Most people do not look at what is just past the stile," she said. He glanced at her then, sideways, and there was something in it she was not prepared for. "No," he said. "They do not." She told herself, that night, and for several nights afterward, that she had imagined the quality of that glance, that she was a woman who had lived for 9 months on very little warmth, and was therefore susceptible to misinterpreting its appearance, that he was a duke, and she was a clergyman's daughter in a darned glove, and that whatever he had meant by that glance, it could not have meant what she thought it meant. She was very thorough about telling herself these things. She was not persuaded by them. Her hands, tucking in the edge of the quilt in her small room, were not quite steady. Peregrine Ashvale arrived the following Tuesday, which was the morning she had intended to visit the churchyard, and so she did not go. He was exactly as Lady Constance had described: agreeable, pleasant-featured, easy in his manners, with nothing particular against him, and nothing in particular about him, and he looked at Margot across the dinner table on his first evening with the genial appraisal of a man who had been told to look and was looking. She talked to him about Shropshire, which she had visited once. She was pleasant. She was competent. She was everything a woman in her position, presented with a practical arrangement, was supposed to be. She spent the dinner watching, without appearing to watch, the Duke at the other end of the table, who was watching her in the particular way he had. Still, and measuring, and with something underneath it she had not yet succeeded in naming. The witnessing happened on a Thursday afternoon in late July, when Margot was in the habit of reading to the youngest Ashvale housemaid, a girl of 14 named Agnes Parish, who had broken her wrist in a fall from the back stairs in May, and had not, it turned out, ever been taught to read with any fluency. Margot had discovered this by accident. She had brought a book to Agnes's room when the girl was confined to bed, and had offered to teach her while she recovered, because she could think of nothing else useful to do with the hour, and because the girl had looked at the offered volume with such a mixture of longing and shame that Margot had sat down without waiting to be asked. By July, Agnes could manage 3 pages of simple prose without too much trouble. She was proud of it in the way people are proud of things they have worked genuinely hard for, and she grew more confident every week, and Margot found, to her own mild surprise, that this was the part of her week that felt most like herself. She did not know that on the Thursday in question, the Duke of Ashvale had come looking for her on some household matter, and had been told by Mrs. Yardley that Miss Ellison was in the servants' wing. She did not know that he had followed the sound of a girl's careful reading voice to the half-open door of Agnes's room, and had stood in the corridor listening for considerably longer than the matter that had brought him there required. He heard Agnes stumble on a word and correct herself without prompting. He heard Margot's quiet, "Yes, exactly right." And then the continued reading. He heard, at the end of a page, Margot say, "You are reading better than you were in June. Do you feel that?" And he heard the girl say, with the certainty of someone telling a simple truth, "I feel it. I feel it every time I get to the end of a page, and I know what happened." He had been standing there for 8 minutes when he turned and walked back to his study. He did not pursue the household matter that had brought him looking for her that afternoon. There were things he had been telling himself for approximately 11 months about her. He had told himself she was an adequate companion for his mother. He had told himself he had spoken to her in the library because she was there, and he had something to say. He had told himself the morning walks in the East Garden were a consequence of the East Garden being pleasant in the morning, and not a consequence of anything else. He had told himself the garden in the evening was simply the garden in the evening. He had told himself that the quality of her stillness in a room was a thing he noticed the way one notices good carpentry. On Thursday afternoon, standing in a corridor outside a housemaid's room, having listened to a girl learn to read, he stopped telling himself these things. He was not at dinner that evening. He was not seen about the house the following morning. Mrs. Yardley reported to Lady Constance that His Grace had ridden out early. Lady Constance received this with the expression of a woman who has observed something developing for some time and is determining whether it requires her attention. She determined, on reflection, that it did. She waited until the following Monday, when Margot was reading to her in the west drawing room, the windows open to the garden, the evening light coming in warm and gold. She waited until the end of the chapter, and then she set down her teacup, and she looked at Margot over the fall of the afternoon. "Peregrine has spoken to me," she said. "He is prepared to make you a formal offer of marriage. He asks for your answer by Thursday, as he must return to London. The arrangement would be, as I have said, a practical one. You would have a home and a position. That is, I think considerably more than your prospects currently suggest." Margot set her bookmark. "I see," she said. "I think," Lady Constance said, with a precision that had a point to it, "that you are under a misapprehension about certain things, Miss Ellison. I think you have allowed yourself to imagine something that is not available to you. My son's interest in your welfare is the interest of a man who takes his household responsibilities seriously. It is not," she said, "anything else. And I believe a woman of your intelligence, unencumbered by romantic illusions, can see that clearly." Margot did not move. She had the sensation of something being pressed down into her chest, something that would need to find its way back up at some point, but was not permitted to do so now. She looked at Lady Constance and thought, "She believes this. She is not being cruel for the pleasure of it. She believes her son is not capable of choosing a woman without a fortune, and she is protecting him from what she sees as an embarrassment. That is almost worse." "I understand," Margot said. She excused herself from the remainder of the evening with a headache. She sat in her room with her hands in her lap and looked at the wall and thought about Betsy Crane, who had been 19 and had worked hard and had died in this house and been put in the corner of the churchyard, and she thought, this is what it costs. This is what it costs to be a woman in a house that does not belong to you. You become a footnote. You become a convenience. You become a woman in your position. And then you become a grave that someone who loved you visits in the spring. until she is gone too. She decided she would accept Peregrine Ashvale's offer on Wednesday. She did not go to the library on Tuesday morning. She went to the churchyard instead, with Hawthorne, even though it was not Tuesday of her usual week, because she needed to sit beside something that held still. She did not hear the gate open behind her until it had already swung. He stood at the gate with his hat in his hands and the morning light behind him, and she had the brief, absurd thought that she was about to have a very difficult conversation in a graveyard, which was, in its way, appropriate. "I saw you come this way," he said. "Yes," she said. She did not stand up. She kept her hand on the limestone of the grave marker, lightly, because she needed something that held still. He came through the gate. He did not come to where she knelt, but he stopped near the yew tree, at a decent distance. And he stood the way he stood when he was working through something he had not yet resolved. Very still, his eyes on the gray limestone. "My mother has spoken to you," he said. "Yes," she said. "About Peregrine." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. A bird moved in the yew tree. The morning smelled of grass and damp stone and the faint sweet of the hawthorn. "She believes," he said, "that she is protecting the estate. She has believed that since my father died. She is not wrong about the estate requiring protection. She is wrong," he said, "about nearly everything else." Margot looked up at him. He was looking at the grave marker. "Betsy Crane's mother wrote to me," he said, 3 years ago. After the fever, after the burial. She wrote to tell me she did not blame me for her daughter's death, which was a generosity I had not deserved. She said in the letter that Betsy had been happy here, that she had written home about the estate as if she were painting it. He paused. "I have thought about that letter a great deal." Margot said nothing. "I have thought," he said, "that a person who describes the world as if she is painting it is a person who looks at it more carefully than most. And I have thought," he said more slowly, "that looking carefully at the world is a capacity that is rarely rewarded and almost never noticed by the people who ought most to notice it." She was very still. She had the sensation, which she had taught herself not to trust, that he was saying something beneath what he was saying. He looked at her then, directly, without the measuring quality. Just looked. "I am not going to make you a practical arrangement," he said. She waited. "I am going to ask you," he said, "whether you have any feeling for me that is not merely." He stopped. The word he had not said hung in the air between them. She thought of Lady Constance's words. "A woman in your position cannot afford romantic preference." She thought of the curate's wife nodding, the table absorbing the pleasant dismissal. She thought of Betsy Crane's letter describing the estate as if she were painting it, and the 19-year-old girl who had written it, and the gray limestone in the corner, and the hawthorn she had carried here every spring, because she had made a promise, and kept it even when no one was watching. She kept faith with the dead, Edmund Ashvale was saying to her, with every word he had not yet said. "I want to know if you will keep faith with me." "Yes," she said. "I have a feeling that is not merely anything." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he held out his hand. She took it. She stood up from the grass with the hawthorn still in her other hand, and she stood in front of him, and the morning was very quiet. And she thought, "This is not what I expected. This is not what any woman in my position is supposed to expect." And then she thought, "Perhaps that is not a category I belong to any longer." "I intend," he said, "to speak to my mother this afternoon." "She will not approve," Margot said. "No," he agreed. "She will not." And then, after a moment, in the voice he used, when he had settled something fully, the level voice that derived its authority from certainty rather than from volume, "She is not required to." She had not expected that either. She discovered, standing in the churchyard in the morning light with his hand warm around hers, that she had underestimated him in several directions. He did not speak to his mother that afternoon. He spoke to his mother that evening, after dinner, in the west drawing room, and Margot was not present for it, which was by his design. She was in the library. She could not read. She sat with a book open in her lap and listened to the house, which had a particular quality of holding still that she recognized as the quality of a household bracing for something it was not sure of. Mrs. Yardley knocked on the library door at 8:30 and brought her a cup of tea without being asked, which meant the whole of the household already knew, or had made a reasonable inference, which amounted to the same thing. Margot drank the tea. She thought about a great many things. She thought about her father's library of 700 volumes and the £11, and the cousin who had arranged the placement without consulting her. She thought about Lady Constance's folded fan and the pale blue eyes accustomed to command. She thought about a girl named Betsy Crane who had described an estate as if she were painting it, and she thought, someone ought to remember that. Someone has. Someone will. The house settled into its night silence. She was still in the library when the library door opened. He stood in the doorway for a moment, then came inside and closed the door behind him. He looked tired, in the particular way of a man who has done something that required him and is now on the far side of it. He crossed to the fire and stood with his back to it, and she watched him from her chair, and the room was warm and quiet. "She is angry," he said. "I imagined she would be," Margot said. "She said several things about your position and your family, and the inappropriateness of the attachment, which were accurate in their facts and wrong in their conclusions." He looked into the fire. "She also said that I was making a decision from sentiment rather than sense, and that she had not raised me to be sentimental." "And?" Margot said. He looked at her. "I told her that I was making a decision from the most accurate perception I had managed in some years, and that she was welcome to call that sentiment if it pleased her." He paused. "She is not speaking to me at present. She will speak to you again," Margot said. "She cares about the estate. She will speak to you when she has decided how to manage the situation." He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something lighter, not quite amused, but close to it, which she understood was not a common thing. "You are very calm about this," he said. "I have been very calm about things I could not control for 29 years, she said. "I thought I might try it with something I could." There was a silence. The fire shifted. He said quietly, "Margot." It was the first time. Her given name in his voice, which was low and level as it always was, and yet entirely different for being directed at her. At the particular weight the name carried when he said it. She felt it move through her like a change in the air. "I need you to know," he said, "that this is not a practical arrangement." "I know," she said. "I need you to know," he said, "that I have known since approximately November that it was not going to be a practical arrangement, and that I have spent a considerable amount of energy since November telling myself otherwise." "November," she said, "when you began using the library at 6:30 in the morning." He was quiet. "I noticed," she said. "Yes," he said. "I suspected you had." And then, after a moment, with the same directness he used when issuing commands, the economy of a man who chose his words precisely and wasted none of them, "I would like to ask you properly." She set down the unread book. "Then ask me properly," she said. He crossed the room, and he took both her hands, and she looked up at him in the firelight. And he said, "Will you marry me, Margot? Not as a practical arrangement, not as a rescue from your position, because I want you there, in this house, in this library, at that grave in the churchyard every spring if you wish it, beside me, for every year I have remaining." She thought of the limestone in the corner. She thought of the hawthorn. She thought of a girl who had described an estate as if she were painting it, and a man who had ridden through 3 nights of hard weather and arrived too late, and all the years both of them had spent trying to put things right by carrying on. She thought, this is what keeping faith looks like when it finds its way back to the living. Yes, she said. The announcement was made the following morning at breakfast, before Lady Constance had arranged her composure sufficiently to prevent it. The Duke of Ashvale sat at the head of the table and said, in the same level voice in which he said everything, "I wish to inform the household that I have asked Miss Ellison to be my wife, and she has accepted. We will be married before the autumn." He looked at his mother. "I trust this requires no further discussion." Lady Constance set down her teacup. The table waited. Peregrine Ashvale, who was departing that morning, looked into his eggs with the philosophical expression of a man who has rearranged his expectations. "Well," Lady Constance said, at last. She looked at Margot across the table, with those pale blue eyes, and Margot looked back at her. And there was a long moment in which Lady Constance appeared to conduct an internal negotiation of considerable complexity. "Well," she said again, more quietly, "I suppose you will need a proper settlement drawn up." It was not approval. It was not warmth. It was the first crack in the confidence, and both of them recognized it for what it was. Edmund looked at Margot. Something moved briefly across his face. The thing she had decided in November was too dangerous to hope for. Now out in the open, and entirely decided. "Miss Ellison," said Mrs. Yardley. From the sideboard, in the voice of a woman who has held herself together through many things, and is nearly done it again. "May I say, on behalf of the household, that we are very pleased." Margot said, "Thank you, Mrs. Yardley," and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it in the specific way one means things that have come through very long waiting and arrived exactly where they ought to. The county called at Whitmore Hall again in September, the dinner before the autumn markets, and Margot attended as the Duchess of Ashvale, which was a sentence she had not yet entirely persuaded herself was real. She wore a gown she had chosen herself in deep green silk, simple and well cut, and she did not darn a single glove. She sat near the head of the table, beside Edmund, who remained exactly who he had always been, grave and contained and economical with his words, but who had a way now of resting his hand near hers on the table, just near, not touching in company but present, that she was coming to understand as his language. Lady Whitmore received her with the warmth of a woman recalibrating her categories and doing it as gracefully as she could manage. Charlotte Whitmore asked about the London season in a tone that had migrated from condescension to something almost hopeful. Sir Gerald offered a toast. The room drank. Margot held her glass and listened to the room absorb the rearrangement, and she thought, "This is the same room. These are the same people. And the world they are all living in now is not the same world." She continued to visit the churchyard. She did not ask permission, and she was not required to. The following April she went on a Tuesday, as she always had, and this time she brought hawthorn from the hedge on the far side of the lower meadow stile. The hawthorn she had shown Edmund in the long summer evening, when they had walked the east garden path, and the world had been in the process of becoming different, without either of them quite saying so. She went alone, in the way she always had, and she crouched at the gray limestone marker with the lichen at its base, and she laid the blossoms carefully, and she stayed for a while with her hand on the cool stone. She said, "Someone remembers." The churchyard was quiet. The yew tree moved in the light April wind. When she rose and turned back toward the gate, Edmund was there, not where he had been the spring before, on the rise above the wall, half concealed. He was at the gate, in his navy tailcoat, with his hat in his hands, waiting. He had not hidden. She walked to him, and he opened the gate, and she came through it, and he looked at the hawthorn she had left at the grave, and then at her. "Every spring," he said. "Every spring," she said. He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked back across the lower meadow in the April morning, the estate rising before them, the stone manor pale in the early light, the gardens beginning their slow re-emergence from the winter. A pair of lapwings crossed the near field. The grass was still cold and slightly wet, and the sky was the specific white-gray of an English April morning that would become blue by noon. Agnes Parrish was reading on her own now. She had progressed to a small collection of travel essays she had borrowed from the library with Margot's encouragement, and she read them in the half-hour before her duties began, sitting in the kitchen window. She had shown Margot a passage the previous week, a description of the Adriatic coast, and her face had had on it the expression of someone discovering that the world was larger than they had been told. Lady Constance had not warmed precisely, but she had adjusted. She had attended the wedding with every appearance of dignity, and at the wedding breakfast she had spoken to Margot for nearly 20 minutes about the correct management of the estate accounts, which was the highest compliment she knew how to pay. She remained formidable, and she remained precise. And she had, twice in the winter, asked Margot to read to her in the evenings, which was not something she had done since November. She had not called Margot a woman in her position since July. Margot had noticed. The library was theirs now, fully and without apology. Edmund used it in the mornings, as he always had, and Margot used it in the mornings, as she always had. And the fact of their both using it had ceased to require explanation or accommodation, and had become simply the way the morning was. He read at the far desk, and she read in her chair, and the fire burned, or did not burn depending on the season. And sometimes an hour passed in which neither of them spoke, and neither of them needed to, and it was the most company she had ever been kept. He had told her, in the winter, about the 3 nights of hard riding in November 5 years past. He had told her about arriving at the house to find Mrs. Yardley at the door, and Mrs. Yardley's face, and the specific quality of the silence in the corridor that told him before anyone said a word. He had told her about riding back in the gray morning and not being able to name what he felt, because it was not grief exactly, and it was not guilt exactly, but it was something composed of both, and also of a kind of rage at the inadequacy of arriving and doing one's best when one's best had not been sufficient. He had told her once, quietly, in the fire-lit library, and she had listened without trying to adjust it into something lighter, because she understood that some things needed to be said in the darkness to someone who would hold still while you said them, and that was what she was there for. And it was enough. She did not know if he knew, yet, that that was also what he was there for. She thought he was beginning to. The following spring, and the spring after that, she laid hawthorn at the gray limestone marker, and the stone remained where it was, and the lichen spread slowly at the base, and the churchyard held its quiet the way churchyards do. The second year, Edmund came with her from the gate, all the way to the grave, and crouched beside her in the April morning, and was quiet. The year after, he brought his own hawthorn from the hedge on the far side of the stile, which meant he had gone there himself, which meant he had learned where it was. which meant he had kept faith. In his way. With what she had shown him. He was not a man who said things he had not done first. By the 4th spring of their marriage, Mrs. Yardley had added a small marker beside Betsy Crane's grave on behalf of the household. It was very simple. It said only what was true, that she had been known here, and that she had worked with good faith, and that she was not forgotten. Margot stood and looked at it in the April morning light and thought, this is what keeping faith makes, given enough time. Not monuments, not reversals. Just the ordinary keeping. The Tuesday mornings and the hawthorn and the person who arrives at the gate and waits, and the slow accumulation of springs that add up, in the end, to something that holds. She took Edmund's arm, and they walked home together across the lower meadow, and the house rose ahead of them, and the April sky had gone from white to blue, as it always did by noon, and the lapwings were calling in the far field, and the world was exactly the size it had always been, and also, in every way that mattered, larger. Thank you for staying until the end of Margot's story. If her faithfulness moved you, leave a word in the comments. And if you would like to hear more of these quiet histories, the ones that happen in the corners that most people walk past, come back. There are more worth telling.